1944. World War II was reaching its dramatic climax.
Rocket ships firing, aircraft flying overhead.
As the Allies waged total war to liberate occupied Europe.
This was a war in which all sides were learning as they went.
From the beaches of Normandy...
The water was full of blood. The water was bright red.
...to the forests of Germany.
Ich sehe dort heute noch die ganzen Toten liegen.
Both sides deployed weapons of ever greater power and sophistication.
And this tank suddenly gives the American a real big advantage. It's a very effective beast.
This is the story of the Western Allies' final campaign, told by the men on both sides who were there.
You did what you did. You fire and you maneuver.
He was my brother.
Following the enormous success of D-Day, Allied forces faced a bitter struggle for the French city of Caen.
When the 3rd British tried to capture Caen in Operation Mitten, they were slaughtered.
I knew it was me already. And when you're like that, you don't think the bullets actually were whipping past my euro, I can tell you.
A battle that would descend into weeks of bloody, attritional fighting. A living hell for soldiers on the front line.
Da ging ein Kampf, ich glaube, über 14 Tage mit fast täglichem Wechsel des Besitzers dieser Höhe 112.
One of the toughest battles in France. I'll never forget it. I'll never forget the experience.
June 1944, and Hitler's Germany was on the back foot. In Russia, it had suffered disastrous defeats at Stalingrad and Kursk, and now struggled to hold back Stalin's Red Army. In Italy, the Germans had abandoned Rome and were retreating north. While in northern France, on D-Day, the 6th of June, Allied forces had opened the long-awaited Second Front, fighting their way ashore at Normandy in the largest operation in military history. Now, the region's capital, Caen, became the focus of a gigantic slugging match between Allied and German forces. For the Allies, Caen was the key to breaking out of Normandy, but was proving a hard nut to crack.
Taking of Caen was a very important part of the operation, because by holding the town, you held the main routes in and out of Normandy, rail and road.
Edwin Bramall was a 20-year-old infantry officer during the Battle of Normandy, who went on to become the head of British armed forces.
All our fighting, to begin with, was in sight of Caen, really, and which we'd hoped to get the first day, but it didn't work out like that.
Bruce Melanson from Nova Scotia had lied about his age so he could be sent overseas with his unit in 1940.
Montgomery and Churchill and then our own generals at that particular time, they informed us that we were to take Caen in 2 weeks. It took us almost 2 months.
The killing fields of Normandy were the first experience of combat for thousands of Allied soldiers, often pitched against elite German units in a costly struggle to break their resistance. As a young officer, Patrick Delaforce commanded a troop of 4 self-propelled artillery guns in Normandy.
Everybody put a brave face on it because we knew it was a war of attrition, that with a bit of luck, if one of our chaps were being killed, with a bit of luck, maybe one of the Germans was being killed.
With the Germans rapidly sending reinforcements to Normandy, the Allies now had to quickly build up their own forces, fight off the expected German counterattack, and launch their assault on Caen. The task fell to commander of Allied land forces in Normandy, General Bernard Montgomery. Popularly known as Monty, Britain's foremost general of the Second World War was a supremely professional and precise commander who distinguished himself early in the war by getting his division out of Dunkirk almost unscathed. Rapid promotion followed, and in 1942, Monty was given command of British and Commonwealth forces in North Africa, where he decisively defeated Rommel's Afrika Korps. A prickly character who many found unbearably arrogant, he was nonetheless popular with his men.
Montgomery was an extremely capable commander with a massive ego who had the habit, particularly after the war, of saying that he could pre-plan all his battles perfectly and the enemy never had any say in it. He just carried out his master plan. The way the Battle of Normandy was fought, once the initial landings were over, Montgomery focused entirely on the British and Canadian side, and he left the Americans, good alliance politics, to fight their own battle.
While US First Army under General Omar Bradley slowly fought its way through Normandy hedgerows on the Allied right flank, Monty began planning the capture of Caen. For the Battle of Caen, Montgomery would rely on Lieutenant General Dempsey's British Second Army. Initially, it had just the divisions that landed on D-Day. But more troops were landing in Normandy every day, including Monty's North Africa veterans, the 51st Highland and the famous 7th Armoured Division, the Desert Rats. Monty's men could also count on fire support from Royal Navy warships in the Channel, including the heavy guns of HMS Rodney and HMS Roberts. And thanks to the Allies' complete air superiority over Normandy, there would be close air support from bombers and fighter bombers. The Allies were currently stalled 4 miles short of Caen. Canadian attempts to take the city by frontal attack had been repelled by the 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend. So Montgomery ordered a pincer attack to squeeze Caen from the east with an attack by the 51st Highland Division towards Ranville, and the west with an attack spearheaded by 7th Armoured towards Tilly-sur-Seulles. He had high hopes his North Africa veterans would soon secure Caen for the Allies. But 7th Armoured's advance soon ran into the difficult Normandy countryside, known as Bocage, a labyrinth of sunken lanes and hedgerows. The Desert Rats were one of the few units equipped with the new British Cromwell tank.
There is a little tendency to judge tanks as if they're always fighting other tanks. And the Cromwell is never compared to something like a Panther as if it's an equal match. But it's fast, it's got the Meteor engine in the back. It's got Christie suspension, which means it's a very smooth ride. And it's actually got the relatively powerful 75mm gun on it. Now, one of the issues of the Cromwell is we could call a design fault. As you look at the vehicle, the driver has a hatch above his head, but if the turret is turned, firing, it can close over that hatch. And if the gun or the vehicle is hit, that means that the driver can't get out.
As 7th Armoured approached Tilly-sur-Seulles, they ran into units of the Panzer Lehr Division, an elite unit drawn from armoured warfare instructors that had just arrived in Normandy.
It's as if you look at the map afterwards, I have done it, as if you drew a line across the map and said, you've got this far, if you go any further you're going to fight. And by golly did we fight. And we went into Tilly-sur-Seulles and we did fight, and that was our first real combat situation. I think they had 25 goes at that before they eventually took Tilly-sur-Seulles. It was a hell of a fight. 12th Panzer Lehr were there.
They were not easy to deal with. They would put sticky bombs on tanks and things like that if we had half a chance. But I was troop leader for regimental headquarters, so I was further back. And the C Squadron was in front of us, and one of their troops turned sideways down a hedge at right angles, and every tank was knocked out. I saw them a week or two later, and they still had bits of people inside.
The point I've often made to my friends who were there on D-Day, when you got there, there was no Germans there. They didn't expect you. But they was expecting us, and they had tanks and God knows what else, you see.
I hit the deck, and the bloke walking near me must have taken a direct hit because his hands landed in front of me. As I hit the deck, a hand landed with me. The whole arm like that landed with me, and I screamed my head off.
Experienced German troops fought the British to a standstill. But the situation changed on the 12th of June. Attacks by the US 1st and 2nd Infantry Divisions on the British right flank found a gap in the German line. 7th Armoured Division advanced through the hole, making for Villers-Bocage, in an attempt to encircle Caen from the southwest. As British tanks arrived in the village of Villers-Bocage, French civilians came out to welcome them and celebrate the end of 4 years of occupation.
And we came in, beautiful day. People came out on the streets with flowers and cider and calvados. And we thought, this is great, no sign of any Germans.
I wasn't particularly worried myself because the French people said, no, there's no German tanks actually in Villers-Bocage, it's all in Tracy-Bocage and the other villages around. So we went through the town quite quickly, and they told us, close up, close up. And so I was only about 20, 30 yards behind the colonel's tank.
But the French villagers were wrong, and their celebrations were premature.
We'd been told to expect 30% casualties at D-Day, but we didn't get them till Villers-Bocage.
Unbeknownst to John Cloudsley Thompson and his squadron, they decided to pause the advance right next door to a company of the 101st SS Heavy Tank Battalion, which was now approaching rapidly from the east.
I was rather busy looking at the map and trying to work out what was happening. And then, very suddenly, the tank in front of me burst into flames with a big explosion.
Their column had been ambushed by one of Germany's feared Tiger heavy tanks.
I saw this tank come, it moved the 88mm just like that, then wham! And the shot came, and I was standing up in the turret looking through the periscope. I ducked down, and I felt a tingling between my legs. I thought, well, lucky my legs were apart, because I knew that the shot must have gone between.
In command of the 55-ton steel monster was a Waffen-SS legend, Obersturmführer Michael Wittman.
He earns his reputation on the Eastern Front, and he's an absolute gift to the German propaganda machine. Wittman's Tigers are in France in the summer of 1944, and after the D-Day landings, they are moved up to try and block British advances around Caen. As part of the advance, the British 7th Armoured Division races forward to capture high ground around the village of Villers-Bocage. Now, Wittman's Tigers have just been offloaded, and they're resting very near that village. As soon as Wittman hears that the British 7th Armoured are parked up on the side of the road, he attacks, and he knocks out many British vehicles.
Wittman's 15-minute rampage through the town of Villers-Bocage knocked out 13 British tanks, 2 anti-tank guns, and 13 other armoured vehicles.
And that was actually pretty horrifying because you could see tanks being blown up, and then you think, well, it could be me next time, but then you have to dismiss that from your mind because that's the way life goes.
Wittman's Tiger was eventually disabled by an anti-tank gun, but by then, the damage was done.
We'd lost half the regiment in that one day in Villers-Bocage, which was really disastrous.
German news services quickly leapt on Wittman's success.
Now, the German propaganda machine immediately inflates this victory. He's interviewed on German radio that very evening. This inflates the reputation of Michael Wittman and, of course, the Tiger tank. In actual fact, that battle was much more of a draw, and Wittman had lost precious German assets, Tiger tanks, that could not easily be replaced.
The following night, the British returned to Villers-Bocage, when 300 heavy bombers unleashed devastation on the village and strategic crossroads.
We saw a lot of bombers coming over and clouds of smoke in the distance and masses of these British bombers coming over to bomb Villers-Bocage. And that's when it became the most heavily bombed town in Normandy, or anyway in the British sector during the war ever. It was very, very badly smashed.
The Allies could take some comfort from the fact they'd not had to face these powerful German armoured forces on D-Day itself. Army Group B commander Erwin Rommel had wanted these elite units stationed on the coast, ready to smash the Allied invasion on the beaches. But he'd been overruled by Adolf Hitler, who insisted the prized panzer divisions be held back as a reserve and used only with his explicit authority. Under the Third Reich, Hitler wielded complete power over the military as both Armed Forces Supreme Commander and Army Commander-in-Chief. He had no formal training as a tactical commander or officer and never rose beyond the rank of corporal during the Great War, but from 1940 onwards began to interfere more and more in military affairs.
By 1944, Hitler had certainly gotten very untrusting of the German High Command, and he wanted to make sure that they were doing what he wanted them to do. That meant things like giving out stand-fast orders where he refused to allow German forces to retreat, telling cities to hold at all costs no matter what the Allies did, and generally getting down to a much lower level than the leader of Germany should have been getting.
Hitler only allowed Rommel 3 panzer divisions to place along the coast. The rest were held back for a decisive counterattack once it was clear where the main Allied invasion was heading. But on D-Day, Hitler's order came too late for the Panzer Reserve to reach the Normandy beaches. So on D-Day itself, the Caen sector was defended by just one weak infantry division of 7th Army, with 21st Panzer Division as a local reserve. But within 24 hours, reinforcements began to arrive from the 1st SS Panzer Corps, and 3 weeks later, from the 2nd SS Panzer Corps. These powerful formations were well equipped and highly motivated.
The showcase divisions included a number of divisions of the Waffen-SS. This was the Nazi Party's private army, independent, at least in structure and organization, of the German army. The Waffen-SS formed from originally what had been the SS, the people who stood as guards for Hitler when he was speaking in the 1930s, and they had grown up by 1944 into a force of about 30 divisions around the world. Fighting in Normandy were 2 of the most remarkable of the German divisions. The 1st SS Panzer, the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler's bodyguard. These were men who were highly committed Nazis and very effective troops indeed, and the division that was spun off from the 1st SS Panzer Division, the Hitler Youth Division, the 12th SS Division Hitler Jugend.
When the Hitler Youth Division was formed in late 1943, they were looking for experienced officers and non-commissioned officers to build the cadre around which they would build this particular division. The ranks and files would then be filled by very young men, and that's why it's called the Hitler Youth Division. So a lot of people were, well, around the age of 18, some of them even younger. And most of these experienced cadres came from the 1st SS Panzer Division. So there was a bit of a relationship between the 2 divisions.
They were Führertreu, they were true to the Führer, and their commitment to Hitler and their fighting abilities were second to none. At the same time, that same commitment made them much more likely to shoot prisoners or kill civilians.
Now facing the cream of Hitler's army, it was more vital than ever that the Allies move reinforcements and supplies rapidly from ships to beaches and then to the front line. To achieve this, they'd set up a hugely sophisticated operation involving thousands of ships, landing craft and amphibious vehicles, as well as 2 giant artificial harbours, codenamed Mulberry A and B. A week after D-Day, the Allies were landing 30,000 troops and 7,000 vehicles every day. But freak weather was about to throw Allied plans into chaos. On the 19th of June, the worst storm to hit Normandy in 40 years tore through the Channel.
June was selected as being the perfect month for the Normandy invasion. It turned out to be almost disastrous. The American harbour on the other side of Armagh broke up, so that was of no use. These massive concrete blocks that the harbour was made of were just tossed around by the seas.
The storm wrecked 800 ships and landing craft, 5 times as many as were lost during the actual D-Day assault.
You have to realise that a 3,500-ton flat-bottomed landing craft, it's a bit like a shoebox. You put it on the water and you blow at it and it will go anywhere. And an LSC of that size, it got blown, and we got well blown.
The beaches were strewn with wreckage and took days to clear.
The consequence of this particular storm was that Allied logistics was thrown into disarray. The logistical resupply of the Allied forces after the storm is down by 50%. And this, of course, gives the Germans, you might argue, a bit of a breathing space. Of course, the Allies still have sheer superiority in man and material, but if they had had both of these Mulberry harbours, things would have been even worse for the Germans.
The storm forced Montgomery to postpone a new offensive against Caen by 5 days. He knew it could prove a costly delay, since according to top-secret intelligence, the enemy were about to receive major reinforcements.
The Germans had what they believed was an unbreakable code that they could use to communicate. They used something called the Enigma machine, which looked like an oversized typewriter. But one of those Enigma machines had actually fallen into the hands of Polish intelligence during the German invasion of Poland in 1939, and the Poles got it to the British. Once they got the machine, the British code-breaking unit at Bletchley Park worked 24/7 to break the German codes and make sure that they could read German messages. For General Montgomery, what Ultra allowed him to do in the battle for Caen was understand what German units were arriving in the defensive lines and how he should respond to them.
Monty was determined to press ahead with his new offensive before German reinforcements entered the battle. The attack, codenamed Operation Epsom, began with a monstrous barrage by 700 guns, including the heavy guns of 4 Royal Navy warships firing at a range of more than 10 miles.
I've seen one Tiger tank that was hit by one of the shells from the Warspite. It was turned over rather like a dinky toy, but that was very rare.
Bombardments by both sides were steadily laying waste to the Norman countryside. Hundreds of farm animals were caught in the crossfire, their carcasses left to fester in the summer heat.
That's one of the worst things I can remember, really. And that was really disgusting. But, you couldn't help yourself. You didn't move. You had to keep under cover. But you might have 4 or 5 dead cows in the field. There's nothing to gosh, the smell of death.
In the wake of the massive bombardment, 2 fresh divisions from British 8th Corps, supported by nearly 600 tanks, would attack south, cross the Odon River, and swing round to encircle Caen. Supporting attacks would be made by the Canadian 3rd Division at Carpiquet Airfield and 49th West Riding Division towards Roré. But the Germans had organised a skillful defence in depth, and casualties were high.
We had to go through countryside. There was open fields. So the snipers were having a ball. You know, they was knocking mainly officers, because then, when they first landed, they had their pips up and their revolver, and, you know, it was obvious officers, so we were going to get the officer. And they were shooting them. We had to finish out with 1 officer.
So there was a lot of fire about, tremendous lot of fire, anti-tank fire, artillery fire. the 15th Scottish Division had a very difficult battle. They lost 250 men in the first hour. We ourselves got shelled a lot, and we also first met this awful weapon, the naval Werfer, which is a smoke thrower, and it's called the Moaning Minnie, and that produced this awful humming sound. And then all these mortar bombs covered an area about the size of a football field. Luckily, you had this warning. So as soon as you heard this awful moaning noise, you took what cover you could in a ditch or in a trench or something like that.
The supporting attack at Roré also ran into fierce opposition.
And we took a couple of villages and we did 3 attacks, and each one of them was large casualties, as all the attacks in Normandy were. And we were pushed back just as soon as we went forward. If you made a gain of 100 yards, that was a major victory, because fighting was beginning to become so terribly intense. And our first 3 attacks, we lost a lot of people.
It took 2 days of grueling combat to get across the Odon River. Then, on the far bank, they faced a battle for a long, low ridge that soon became infamous. Hill 112.
It was the highest point on a series of rolling downland, and it was called 112 simply because it was 112 feet above sea level. It was in a commanding position overlooking the city of Caen, which you could see quite clearly.
Rommel himself said that whoever held Hill 112 held Normandy. We was in the 15th Scottish Division, which was at the side of the hill, and that was known as the Scottish Corridor. And before it was named Death Valley. We was losing there 150 men a day.
Time and again, British soldiers were ordered to advance across open wheat fields, just waiting for dug-in German machine gun crews to open up with one of their most feared weapons.
Because the Germans had been there much, much longer than we'd been there, they had proper positions that were mainly guarded properly with sandbags and what have you, so they were difficult to get rid of. And their machine guns was knocking our blokes out right, left and centre.
The British were up against the devastating MG-42, nicknamed Hitler's Zipper.
The German MG-42 light machine gun was typical of the German design, heavily over-engineered, beautifully made, and used an enormous amount of bullets. It was a very feared weapon, there's no doubt about that. Allied soldiers remembered the sound of it. It was just like the sound of tearing paper.
There's no machine gun that fires like an MG-42. It's a brip, brip, brip.
Like a string of Chinese firecrackers going off next to your ear. That's at once, and and they're very rapid.
You have no options. Once it starts, you've got it. You either get hit or you don't get hit, one or the other.
But the MG-42's extraordinary rate of fire had its drawbacks.
It fired 1,200 rounds a minute, twice the rate of anything that the British used. And the problem with that is that the more bullets you fire, the more bullets you need to make, the more you need to supply, the more you need to transport, the more you need to carry into action.
War ein luftgekühltes Maschinengewehr, das theoretisch in der Minute 3000 Schuss schießen konnte. Das war aber technisch nicht möglich, weil niemand in der Lage war, diese 3000 Schuss in einer Minute vorzuhalten. Es gab 3 MG-Schützen, der das MG hatte, und dann 2, die nur die Munition trugen. Die hatten in so Kästen, und da waren vielleicht 200 drin in jedem Kasten, und jeder konnte 2 Kästen schleppen. Und Sie können sich vorstellen, bis da 200 Schuss raus waren, da braucht man schon ein bisschen Zeit. Also das mit der Minute war Theorie.
In 4 bloody days of attack and counterattack, British 8th Corps suffered 4,000 casualties. British Sherman tanks occupied the forward slopes of Hill 112, but then, astoundingly, they were pulled back.
And they got up to the top, which was a brilliant operation. And then, like the Duke of York's army, they were told to come down again, and nobody ever knew why. And the answer was that Bletchley Park's Ultra had told Montgomery that 2 powerful SS armoured divisions, panzer divisions, were coming up from the south, and that if we'd stayed up there, the whole division, 11th, would have been cut off. And Monty didn't dare risk us at that early stage, so we came down again.
Montgomery therefore took the decision to pull back slightly from the upper slopes of Hill 112 to the next safe position. When the attack up what is called the Roré Spur occurred, the British were waiting for it, and they halted it with heavy German casualties. Montgomery was ready for them. That's the difference Ultra made.
The SS Panzer Division's counterattack was shattered by overwhelming Allied firepower, anti-tank and artillery guns, and strafing attacks by fighter bombers. But despite this, the Allies' swift advance through Normandy had hit an impasse, and Monty couldn't afford to lose momentum. What happened next was to be one of the most controversial episodes of the Normandy campaign. Caen was still in German hands. Montgomery's first 2 attempts to take the city by envelopment had failed. In July, he decided to send British First Corps straight up the middle. Ahead of the assault, codenamed Operation Charnwood, 467 bombers pulverized the northern approaches to the city.
I watched the terrific aerial bombardment of Caen, but very close. I mean, I could feel the whole ground, saw the bombers coming over and feel the whole ground shake. And, we were very close to the bombing.
1 or 2 got hit by anti-aircraft fire, I suppose, and 1 was damaged, but at least he got down. And we all rushed up the hill to see if we could help. But he said, keep away, we've still got bombs on board. So we all ran back down the hill again.
It was blown to bits, Caen was. We always wondered why we'd bombed it so heavy, because when you bomb a place, it makes terrific hiding for infantry, and it makes your job worse and worse.
German positions were then blasted by the 16-inch guns of HMS Rodney, as well as the 6-inch guns of cruisers HMS Belfast and Emerald. Then strafed by RAF Typhoons.
And we had a real view of the Typhoons going into action. And what we saw from where we were on the plains overlooking it. And we could see the Typhoons going in with their rockets, firing on the Tigers from behind. Mind, the fire they were receiving, anti-aircraft fire, was terrific. You know, as Morrow said, they ever got through it.
They did such a wonderful job. Those Typhoons, used to watch them coming, zoom, holy mackerel. Really made you shiver a little bit because of the fact they knew that the enemy was down there, accepting all this, you know.
British and Canadians slowly fought their way through German-held villages into the outskirts of Caen.
Between the coast and Caen, there were about 7 or 8 fortified villages where the Germans had fortified everything and based large numbers of artillery guns, field guns, anti-tank guns. And Galmanche was one of these fortified villages. And we fought twice at Galmanche, and we had one day where we were without infantry, where our infantry had lost so heavily, the colonel pulled the rest of them, or their colonel pulled them out from there. And B Squadron, my squadron of tanks, was in there one day, and we were static. The Germans were on the high ground in the village looking down on us and could see everything that was happening. And every time we moved, they were shelling us, and they were shelling us continuously for a period of about 4 or 5 hours when we were without infantry. And we had orders to hold it and not to pull back. So we had to literally sit there and be shot at.
A mortar come over, the most devastating blast I ever heard in my life. It landed right between Alec Duncan's legs. He was the one in the middle. I don't remember anything that happened, except for a few minutes later, Harold Burden, which was on the left of Alec Duncan, said, "How you doing, Hook?" I said, "I don't know. I don't know how I'm doing." I said, "How's Alec doing?" He says, "Alec is dead. He'd lost both his legs. Both his legs."
On the right of the advance, in house-to-house fighting through the ruins of Caen, the Canadians were again facing die-hard fanatics of the Hitler Youth Division. And rumours were circulating of a massacre of Canadian prisoners.
In this Battle of Caen, we were up against Hitler's toughest troops, the SS troops under General Kurt Meyer. And he's the jerk that killed 24 of our Canadians in the Abbey. He murdered them.
Kurt Meyer, seen here, was convicted after the war by a Canadian court for his part in the murder of Canadian prisoners during the battle.
Well, I'm still mad about it. I still feel that they didn't fight fair. I mean, there's a right and a wrong way to fight a war, and sure, get killed in action or shoot somebody, and not necessarily after he's taken prisoner. That's wrong. That is very wrong. Well, I don't forgive and forget. I just put it in the back of my mind and say, that's the way they were, and they'll. we're not going to change history now.
Fighting around Caen assumed new levels of brutality, with accusations of the shooting of prisoners by both sides.
One of the things that started happening in Normandy was the regular execution of Allied soldiers by German divisions. Some of this was from German units that had been brutalized on the Eastern Front and were extremely violent on the Western Front. Some of this was from units that were more deeply Nazified and patriotic, like the Hitler Jugend. But the result was, in the Battle of Caen, where a number of Canadian soldiers were executed, was that Allied soldiers were getting shot after they had surrendered. The response on the part of the Allied soldiers was often to execute German prisoners in revenge.
After a day of heavy fighting, the pressure from the Allies was so great that Rommel decided to abandon northern Caen and withdraw his forces across the River Orne. On the 9th of July, the northern half of Caen fell to the Allies. Not much of it was left.
Well, it's just pile of rubble. You know, the Air Force done a really good job in it, because I don't think there's a stone left standing, that, to be quite honest. They'd more or less wiped it out altogether.
So the combination of the two armies meeting and firing into a town in the centre, plus the fact that a 1,000 bomber raid was put on it, meant that the town was a massive ruin and rubble.
When we got through past the cobbles, we saw the cathedral was standing, and there was a hospital place beside it with Red Cross marked on it, and that had missed, the bombing had missed that. And that's where most of the French people who were in the town had gathered in this hospital. And so they escaped. There were a lot of people killed, but not as many as would have been if it hadn't been for the sheltering in the hospital, which our bombers had been avoiding.
There was no let-up for the Germans. The next day, Montgomery launched Operation Jupiter. This time, the 43rd Wessex Division would attempt to capture the strategic Hill 112.
We were asked to gain the summit, hold it and keep it, but the Germans were quite equally determined that we were not going to do so. So it was a battle of attrition, mostly between armour and armour, but the infantry were expected to advance over open fields.
Da ging ein Kampf, ich glaube, über 14 Tage mit fast täglichem Wechsel des Besitzers dieser Höhe 112. Mal waren wir da oben, mal waren die Engländer bzw. Kanadier, die dort auch im Einsatz waren, oben. Sehr verlustreich, ein kleines Wäldchen, das nachher gar nicht mehr zu erkennen war.
The fight around Hill 112 was an incredibly violent and intensive fight. The Germans had built up a substantial defense in depth, centered around machine guns, anti-tank weapons, high-velocity anti-aircraft and anti-tank guns, tanks, armored personnel carriers, and the Allied soldiers had to fight all their way through it. They knew if they popped their head up, even from a mile away, a German tank or gun might shoot it off. And so they had to slog their way through it, minute by minute, hour by hour, day by day, taking enormous casualties as they went.
The inexperienced Wessex Division were up against Waffen-SS troops supported by Tiger tanks of the 102nd SS Heavy Tank Battalion.
And it became almost a mantra that if you don't know what to do next, go down, dig down, and get your head under the ground level.
The struggle for Hill 112 decimated the Wessex Division. And still they couldn't take its summit, left a no-man's land strewn with dead men and destroyed vehicles.
We took around about 4,000 casualties on that period, on that battleground, which was the villages as well as the hill.
As the fighting raged, the Allies struck a lucky blow with potentially huge consequences. Rommel's staff car was strafed by a Canadian Spitfire and driven off the road. The driver was killed, and Rommel was left unconscious for a week.
The consequences of that are severe, because Rommel had been the driving force in the defense of northwestern France, behind the establishment of defensive positions, and of course he had a very clear view of how he wanted to fight the Allies, because he'd fought them before. The moment he's wounded, the German command structure is not really thrown into disarray, but one of the big problems is that the commander, von Kluge, basically now has to double hat. And not only is he now responsible for the conduct of all the force in northwestern France, but he also takes over Rommel's position as well. He becomes an extremely busy man, you might say. And his way of fighting differed quite severely from the way that Rommel wanted to fight.
With German high command in confusion, cautious, methodical Montgomery planned a final push on Caen, one which he declared would lead to the long-awaited breakthrough. But for Allied infantry and tank crews, the fighting would be as brutal as anything they'd faced yet. The offensive began on the 18th of July, 1944. Codenamed Operation Goodwood, the first phase would be an attack west of Caen to suck in German reserves. Then the main assault would be launched east of Caen, spearheaded by 750 tanks of the British 7th, 11th and Guards Armoured Divisions. Meanwhile, in Operation Atlantic, Canadian 2nd Corps would take the southern half of Caen. Allied bombers rained thousands of tons of high explosives onto German positions. The raid was followed by a gigantic artillery barrage. Then Allied infantry and armor began their advance.
Was für die deutschen Soldaten die wesentlichen Verwundungen brachten, waren die Materialüberlegenheit der Artillerieschläge erst einmal, bevor die Infanterie dann, die gegnerische, in diesem Fall die gegnerische Infanterie, vorgegangen ist.
At first, there was rapid progress through shattered villages and cratered fields, as German soldiers, dazed by the bombardment, gave themselves up. But then, from camouflaged positions, the feared German 88s opened up, picking off British tanks one by one.
Facing the British armour attack at Goodwood is a very strong German defence in depth. Not only have they got fortified farmhouses, they've got assault guns hidden, they've got weapons like the famous PaK-43 anti-tank gun. That's one of these ones here behind me. It's an 88mm gun. and it can fire a solid shot, armour-piercing round that would penetrate one of the British Sherman tanks out to about 2.5 kilometres away. So you have the situation that British tanks are being knocked out and they can't even see the enemy that is firing at them.
This exceptionally powerful anti-tank gun had been designed to take on Allied bombers.
They were the ones that we always feared, the 88s. They could be used, the 88s, even at anti-aircraft guns. They were an all dual-purpose gun. They could fire tanks against tanks and aircraft. They were a marvellous weapon, they were.
The Germans first used the 88mm gun as a flat gun, in other words, an anti-aircraft gun. And the idea there is they're firing rounds, such as this one here, to an enormous height to try and knock down a bomber, something up to about 20,000 feet. Now, when in the 1940 campaign, Rommel says to some flat gunners, aim your guns not in the air, but down at some approaching British tanks, and then the gun becomes a really effective anti-tank gun.
The 88, you would not hear it till it would explode, and then you'd hear the sound of it coming. That's how fast it was. That's the one I told you was unbelievable, that 88. The ones that knocked our tanks out just like heck.
By the end of the day, the British had advanced 3 miles, while the Canadian 2nd and 3rd Divisions encircled Caen and completed its capture the following morning. At long last, Caen was in Allied hands. But Montgomery also wanted the heavily defended ridgelines south of the city as a springboard for his breakout from Normandy. For 2 days, British and Canadian tanks and infantry struggled to advance in the face of heavy machine gun and anti-tank fire. Neither envied the other's situation.
I never wanted to be in the tanks, and the guy in the tank never wanted to be the infantryman either, because he looked and saw us with no protection. It's the same with every guy's job, even the guys in the fighter planes will look at us and think, God, thank God I'm not down there, and I think, thank God I'm not up there. At least I could dig a hole in the ground. You can't do anything. You got to stay there and take it.
The British and Canadian onslaught was relentless, giving battered German divisions no time to recover or regroup. German units were at breaking point. Divisions moved to the rear for much-needed rest suddenly found themselves thrown back into the front line to fend off the latest Allied attack.
They had very little support in terms of reserves coming up. They had more or less exhausted their reserves for Normandy, and simply they were under orders to hold to the last man, and in many cases they did. This was a combination of extreme bravery and just the nature of young men put in a situation in which if you retreat, your own side will shoot you, and if you don't, the other side will shoot you. It's an appalling situation, and it was due to Hitler's order to halt in place and face the firepower that the Allies could bring to bear against them.
The 6-week Battle of Caen was won at a high price. Operation Goodwood alone cost 5,500 British and Canadian casualties and more than 300 tanks. The German army also suffered heavy losses, but incomplete records mean the true number will never be known.
The bodies would be picked up by the medical people, you know, afterwards. The smell, the stench, that was the Battle of Caen. That's what you experienced, that's what you seen, that's what you looked at. German bodies, Canadian bodies, British bodies, everything was right there to look at, amongst the pigs and the horses and the cows and everything else. That's war. That's war. That's what Caen was like.
As many as 20,000 French civilians also lost their lives during the Normandy campaign, most in Allied bombing raids.
Their villages, awful, they're totally destroyed. And there's no reason really why the people who live in Normandy should be particularly grateful. And we destroyed their countryside. Caen, the big city, Villers-Bocage, we destroyed them all. The RAF smashed Caen, which really wasn't strictly necessary, and we could see it happening.
The capture of Caen did not lead to the dramatic breakout Montgomery had promised. The British and Canadians were still penned in by the heavily defended ridges south of the city, and Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of Europe, was way behind schedule. But what the Battle of Caen had achieved was to force German commanders to commit their reserves and their most powerful panzer units to the eastern sector of the battlefield, just to hold the line. Now, 30 miles to the west, General Omar Bradley's US First Army was about to reap the reward.
By pouring in all their reinforcements toward Caen, the Germans substantially weakened their defensive lines facing the American First Army farther south. And what that meant, as Bradley readied his offensive around St. Lo, was there weren't that many Germans facing him on the defensive.
On the 25th of July, 1944, General Bradley and the US Army launched Operation Cobra. They would achieve the great breakout that had eluded the British and Canadians at Caen, and prove their sacrifices had not been in vain.